You have probably seen this dynamic before. Maybe you've even lived it. One person in a relationship checks their phone obsessively, needing constant reassurance and connection. But the closer they push, the more their partner feels smothered, instinctively pulling away and creating distance right when things start to feel safe. When we watch this loop play out, we tend to write it off as bad luck. We blame poor choices in partners, or we decide that two people just have incompatible personalities. But the friction follows a predictable sequence researchers call the anxious avoidant trap. The anxious partner's pursuit for closeness triggers the avoidant partner's need for space. When the avoidant partner withdraws, the anxious partner's panic intensifies, pursuing harder. The loop feeds itself. The friction feels personal, but it follows a pattern that seems almost automated, as if both people are following a script they never actually agreed to. A script written long before they had the words to describe it. This recurring cycle of reaching and retreating is the core of what psychologists call attachment theory. It suggests that our adult conflicts are shaped by the very first bond we ever formed. In the 1950s and 60s, British psychiatrist John Bowlby studied children who had been separated from their parents in hospitals and institutions. Bowlby noticed that even when the children were fed and physically comfortable, they remained inconsolable. Their distress reached beyond physical needs. It looked unmistakably like grief over the loss of an emotional connection. He proposed that the quality of care a child receives, how consistently responsive a parent is, creates an internal working model. This is a mental template the child forms for how all future relationships will operate. Human beings are biologically wired to seek proximity to a caregiver. This bond ensures our physical survival, while also providing the emotional regulation and sense of safety required to navigate the world. This initial template becomes a permanent lens. It teaches a developing brain whether closeness leads to connection or whether vulnerability leads to pain. In the 1970s, Bowlby's colleague, psychologist Mary Ainsworth, designed an experiment to make these invisible blueprints visible. She called it the strange situation. The mechanics were simple. A mother and her toddler were placed in a room together. The mother would briefly leave and then return. Ainsworth simply watched how the child reacted at the exact moment the mother came back. She observed 3 distinct patterns. Some children were quickly comforted when the mother returned. They settled down and went right back to playing. They trusted that their caregiver was consistently responsive. We call this a secure attachment. Other children were frantic and inconsolable, unable to calm down even with the mother right there in the room. They had experienced a caregiver who was inconsistent, available one day, absent the next. Their nervous systems learned to constantly signal distress to keep the parent's attention. This is anxious attachment. A third group barely acknowledged the mother's return at all. They appeared entirely indifferent. These children strategy, the child learned that suppressing their emotional needs was safer than relying on someone who wouldn't respond. This is avoidant attachment. These toddler survival strategies carry forward into adulthood. Secure trust becomes a healthy partnership. Anxious hypervigilance becomes an obsession with perceived rejection. And avoidant emotional suppression becomes a deep discomfort with intimacy. Which brings us back to our couple trapped in that agonizing push-pull loop. Why would someone who desperately craves closeness be drawn to someone who needs distance? For the anxious partner, the avoidant person's emotional distance feels like home. It recreates the emotional landscape of their childhood. The affection feels just slightly out of reach, providing the familiar, intermittent reward they were trained to chase. On the flip side, the anxious partner's pursuit serves a purpose for the avoidant individual. It makes them feel chosen, while simultaneously providing a constant excuse to retreat back to safety. Neither person is trying to cause pain. Instead, 2 nervous systems are performing the exact roles they were trained for, creating a self-sustaining cycle that recreates their oldest childhood wounds. If this code is wired into our nervous systems from birth, before we even have language or memory, are we doomed to repeat it forever? No. Attachment styles are deeply rooted, but they are not fixed. Research shows that you can achieve what psychologists call earned security. The nervous system resists quick changes. To update its ancient programming, it requires a massive amount of repeated, safe evidence, often achieved through deliberate therapy or through a long-term relationship with a consistently secure partner. You do not erase who you are. You simply provide your brain with enough new evidence to rewrite the internal working model until it finally recognizes that closeness is safe. If you are anxiously attached, your work is learning to pause. Before you send that text or demand reassurance, you have to learn to distinguish between an actual present-day threat and a familiar childhood fear of abandonment. If you are avoidantly attached, your work is learning to tolerate the discomfort of intimacy. You practice letting someone in through small, deliberate doses, rather than instinctively fleeing the moment connection feels dangerous. Your attachment style isn't a diagnosis, it is not a life sentence, and it's certainly not your fault. It is simply a map of where your nervous system has been. But maps do not dictate where you go next. By understanding the invisible pattern that wrote your past, you gain the power to write a new future. A future where love doesn't have to hurt to be real.